There were big differences between the northern and southern sections of the United States, but as the country continued to grow in the 1800s, more and more people started moving out west. This led to a whole new issue. Would slavery be allowed to expand into these new western territories? This really became an issue in 1820, when Missouri applied to become a state. Northerners were very worried that if Missouri joined as a slave state, other states out west would join as slave states too. The biggest issue, though, was over representation in the Senate. In 1820, there was an even number of slave states and free states in the Senate. If Missouri joined the country as a slave state, then the slave states would have more power in Congress. A compromise had to be reached. With the Missouri Compromise, the government decided to bring in 2 new states at a time. Missouri would come in as a slave state, and Maine would join as a free state. But they would not always be able to bring states in 2 at a time. They agreed to use the 3630 line of latitude to decide things in the future. Any new state that was above this line would be a free state. Any state below it would be a slave state. Tariffs are taxes the government puts on goods that come from other countries. Sometimes they're called protective tariffs. Tariffs are designed to encourage people to buy goods from their own country. In the early 1800s, tariffs were a controversial topic. Tariffs had different effects on different parts of the country. The nullification crisis was largely a disagreement over tariffs. The North had a lot of factories and industries. Protective tariffs were very helpful to these businesses. They encouraged people in the United States to buy products they were producing. But these same protective tariffs were not viewed as positively in the South. The South was agricultural. They just needed to send things off to be sold. But because of the tariffs that were in place, they felt like they were being forced to buy goods made in the North. Without the tariffs, they could be buying the same goods from other places and not have to pay nearly as much. Southerners did not like these tariffs. They thought this was just another example of the government trying to control their way of life. In 1828, South Carolinian John C. Calhoun was Vice President of the United States. He was not happy at all about the protective tariffs that had now become law. He wrote a document that shared his thoughts on the issue. He thought individual states, like South Carolina, should be able to decide if a law was unconstitutional. And if it was, then that state should have every right to nullify it. This was a big deal. Calhoun was the Vice President of the United States, and he was saying things that went against the U.S. Constitution. He was also challenging the power of the Supreme Court. According to the Constitution, it was the Supreme Court's job to decide if laws were constitutional or not. Calhoun had introduced a whole new idea into American politics: the idea of states' rights. Congress passed another tariff in 1832. The South Carolina legislature called a meeting. They decided they would nullify the tariff. John C. Calhoun decided he needed to take a stand too. He resigned the vice presidency. South Carolina made him a United States Senator the very next day. In the Senate, Calhoun spoke out against the tariff. He supported the idea of nullification. President Andrew Jackson was not happy with all the controversy caused by the nullification crisis. Like most matters in government, things would end in a compromise. Congress decided to lower the tariff. South Carolina agreed to accept it. While the issue over nullification may have resolved itself, the idea of states' rights would stick around. It would be a major part of the decision of states to leave the Union before the start of the Civil War. The United States continued to expand westward. After a war with Mexico in the 1840s, the United States found itself with even more new lands. But that same question was still there. Would slavery be allowed to spread into these new territories? California became part of the United States after the Mexican War, and when gold was found there in 1849, more and more people headed west. When California applied to become a state, it wanted to be a free state. But this would throw off the balance of free states and slave states in the Senate. So a compromise had to be reached. The Compromise of 1850 was a series of deals. California was allowed to join as a free state, but other states out west would have the chance to vote on whether they would be free or slave states. To make Southerners happy, the fugitive slave law was put in place. This made it harder for slaves to escape from the South. Northerners were happy because the sale of slaves was outlawed in Washington, D.C. Every time a new state popped up out west, it became a political battle between the North and the South. They wanted to see whether these new states would be free states or slave states. In the 1850s, Kansas applied to become a state. Kansas was above the 3630 line of latitude, so according to the Missouri Compromise, it should have joined as a free state. But after California had become a state, that logic was no longer used. Congress decided it was time to come up with a new plan. So it passed the KANSAS-NEBRASKA Act. This called for popular sovereignty. That meant the people in Kansas would vote. They would decide for themselves whether they would be a free state or a slave state. The decision was supposed to be up to the people of Kansas to decide, but people across the country hoped to influence their decision. Northern abolitionists came to Kansas. They wanted to convince people there to make it a free state. Southern slave owners also came to Kansas. They wanted the people there to vote to become a slave state. Things got out of control. There was so much fighting in the area that it got a new nickname. It was called Bleeding Kansas. Some people were getting tired of all the problems that happened every time a new western state tried to join the United States. This led to a brand new political party called the Republican Party. They were not necessarily against slavery, but they did not think slavery should be allowed to spread into the lands out west. One issue over slavery went all the way to the Supreme Court. Dred Scott was a slave. He'd been a slave in the South for most of his life. But in 1830 he was sold to someone who lived in Illinois. Illinois was a free state. When abolitionists heard about his story, they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. They said that once a man was free, he should always be free. The Supreme Court did not agree. The court ruled that African American slaves were not citizens, and it didn't matter if they had been born in the United States. The court said that Dred Scott was nothing more than property. They said that if he was given his freedom, then the government would be taking away property from the man who owned him. Many people in South Carolina were happy about the court's ruling. This court case led to even more sectional differences between the North and the South. The Supreme Court had wanted to end the controversy over the status of enslaved people, but the Dred Scott decision did not end any controversy. It just added to it. Northerners were not happy. They said the court had gone against the will of the people. People in South Carolina applauded the decision. They were more than happy to accept the Supreme Court's ruling on the matter. Debate over the issue of slavery led to the rise of a new political party. It was called the Republican Party. One Republican in particular became very well known. His name was Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, the Republican Party chose Abraham Lincoln as its nominee for president. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He believed in the idea of free soil. That meant he did not think slavery should be allowed to spread into the new territories out west. Abraham Lincoln was not very popular in the South. Most Southerners thought their whole way of life could be in trouble. They did not want a Northern Republican to be elected president. The South was mostly Democratic. But they could not decide on who their candidate for president should be. They ended up with two very different candidates who split each other's votes. This made it even easier for Abraham Lincoln to be elected President of the United States in 1860. After Lincoln's election, South Carolina called a special convention. They planned to secede, or leave the United States. They signed the Articles of Secession to make it official. They said the federal government had not done its job to protect the rights of South Carolinians. Within a few short months, 6 other southern states would join them.